I just wanted to get to the interview, but in the middle of the rain, I found a man bleeding on the sidewalk. I took him home, not knowing who he was. But when I found out, I was already too involved. Grace runs down Lexington Avenue, her sneakers soaked and caked in mud, feeling every step as if she's walking with stones tied to her feet. Her umbrella, useless for the past 15 minutes, dangles broken from her wrist. Her hair drips into her eyes, and her thin coat clings to her body like a second skin, chilled to the bone. She's cold, hungry, and terrified of being late for the most important interview of her life. 20 minutes left. The bus was delayed due to an accident on Broadway, and she no longer has money for a taxi. She picks up the pace, trying to ignore the discomfort of wet socks, when she notices something that makes her stop abruptly. A man lying on the ground just a few meters from the Madison station next to a pile of black trash bags. He's shivering. His face, partly covered in dried blood and mud, is barely visible. His clothes are torn, his shoes without laces, and his body trembles as though it's trying to escape death. People walk past him without stopping. Some give him a look of disdain. Others don't notice him at all. Grace stands still. Her breath trembles. There's something in his half-open eyes that paralyzes her. It's not just fear or pain. It's an intensity that's hard to describe. She approaches cautiously as the rain continues to fall like needles. "Are you all right?" she asks softly. He tries to respond, but his words come out in broken whispers, unintelligible. Yet, there's firmness in his tone. He doesn't sound like a man defeated. Grace glances at her watch. She's already going to be late. She considers walking away, forgetting him. But her legs don't move. She turns back, kneels down, removes her wet scarf and presses it against a gaping wound near his eyebrow. The man groans but doesn't scream. He then looks at her directly, as if he recognizes her. "Mason," he says. Just that. Grace stares at him, confused. She doesn't know if it's his name or if he's hallucinating. She looks around, searching for someone to help, but no one stops. Then she does something she never would have imagined doing that morning. With the few coins left in her pocket, she stops a taxi. She asks the driver to take her to the Jefferson neighborhood. He hesitates, but agrees when she offers her Metro card as collateral. The ride is short, but tense. Grace says nothing. Mason remains silent, leaning against the window, his lips cracked and his eyes closed. When they arrive, she helps him up the wet stairs of the building where he lives with his younger brother and sick mother. It's a small apartment, 2 rooms with peeling walls and the smell of eucalyptus from the natural remedies his mother uses for her lungs. As soon as they enter, Grace's mother sits up in bed, startled. "Who is this man, Grace? What are you doing?" "Just for one night, Mom. He's hurt. No one else helped him. What if he's a criminal? What if he robs us? What if—" "Mom, look at him. He can barely stay awake." The woman doesn't respond. She covers her face with the blanket and watches, saying no more. Grace drags the man to the sofa, removes his soaked shoes, covers him with an old blanket, and goes for a clean towel. Then she heats up some instant soup while she cleans his wounds with hydrogen peroxide. Mason doesn't complain. He just breathes slowly, his gaze fixed on the ceiling. "Who are you?" she asks as she offers him the soup. Mason takes it with trembling hands, takes a sip, and leaves it on the table. "A mistake," he answers. "A mistake that still breathes." The next morning, Mason woke up to the low hum of an old coffee machine sputtering in the small kitchen. The scent of coffee filled the air before he even had the chance to comprehend where he was. For a few moments, he wasn't sure whether he was still dreaming or trapped in some strange, unrecognizable reality. His body ached, his mouth tasted like metal, and his throat was parched. The blanket they had covered him with was thin, rough, but warm. He blinked a few times. The ceiling, white and cracked, didn't speak to him, but when he turned his head, he saw her. Grace, sitting in a plastic chair at the far end of the room, her arms crossed, her gaze fixed on him. She didn't look frightened, but she was alert, on guard. There was a blend of curiosity and skepticism in her eyes. Mason slowly sat up, his face contorted in pain. "Did you sleep?" Grace asked, her voice steady, not moving from her place. He nodded slightly. "I asked you your name last night. You said Mason, but nothing more." Mason avoided her eyes, rubbing his face with both hands, letting out a deep sigh. Then he spoke quietly, almost as if to himself. "I just need a few days, nothing more." Grace wasn't satisfied with the answer, but something in his tone, the way he said it, made her believe him, though she didn't understand why. "We're not a shelter," she replied, firm and matter-of-fact. "My mom is sick. We can't take on other people's problems." Mason finally looked at her. His eyes were different this morning, clearer, less lost. He sat carefully, as if every muscle in his body hurt, and nodded. "I know, and I don't want to cause trouble. Just a few days." At that moment, a child appeared in the room. He was about 8 years old, his hair a messy tangle, his hands covered in glue from a school project. He came up to Mason without hesitation, his face painted with unfiltered curiosity. "Who are you?" the boy asked in a high-pitched voice, looking at him. Mason smiled faintly, his lips barely parting. The boy mirrored him, letting out a brief, innocent laugh. "Henry, go wash your hands," Grace said, without taking her eyes off Mason. But Mason kept his gaze on the child, studying him. Then, suddenly, a deep, rasping cough echoed from the adjacent room. Grace's mother. Mason immediately stood, unsteady on his feet, and moved toward the room. "No," Grace said, quickly intercepting him. "What are you doing? I heard that cough. It's not normal. Does she have bronchodilators?" "What?" Grace replied, confused. "Medications for her lungs. Does she have a regimen, or is she just taking syrups?" Grace looked at him like he was speaking a foreign language. She hesitated, her mind racing. Then, without understanding why, she stepped aside, allowing him to pass. Mason entered the room carefully, nodded a greeting to the woman, and started going through a small box with vials and bottles near the bed. "There's an incorrect combination here," he said, showing her a bottle. "This shouldn't be with this one. It causes retention. Does she have a rescue inhaler?" Grace watched from the doorway, still confused. "How do you know all this? Weren't you just lying on the street like—" She started but trailed off. Mason left the room, met her gaze, and leaning against the wall, replied, "Before I fell, I was at the top." There was no further explanation. He moved to the window, drew back the curtain slightly, and stared at the rain-soaked city outside. Grace wanted to ask more questions, but something in his posture, in the way his shoulders slumped, stopped her. She didn't push any further. Instead, she sighed and said nothing. "You can stay," she said after a moment, her voice softer now. "But there are rules." Mason turned just slightly, his eyes meeting hers. "No questions," she continued. "No problems. And if anything happens, you leave." He nodded, his face unreadable. "Agreed." Night fell with a tense silence. Henry had fallen asleep watching cartoons. The mother snored faintly. Grace, already wearing an old t-shirt with her hair damp, walked into the dining room and found him there. Mason, hunched over the table, writing in an old notebook filled with formulas, symbols, and lines that seemed from another world. "What are you doing?" she asked, approaching. Mason lifted his gaze, offering a slight smile. "Planning my return. And maybe yours too. If you're watching this far, I'm sure you're enjoying it. So I want to ask you to subscribe to the channel. Grace didn't understand what Mason meant by that, but she didn't ask him about it that night. She simply left him there, writing in silence as though he were reconstructing his past with each stroke of the pen. The next morning, Mason was already awake before everyone else, sitting on the hallway floor, surrounded by cables, loose parts, and screwdrivers. The radio that had been broken for months now softly hummed, tuning into a local station. Grace frowned in surprise. "You fixed that thing?" she asked from the kitchen. Mason barely looked up. It had a loose connection, nothing complicated. Over the following days, Mason started fixing things without being asked. He repaired a flickering lamp in Henry's room, soldered the plug for the electric heater, and even managed to improve the Wi-Fi connection, which used to drop every half hour. He did it all without fanfare, without seeking gratitude. Grace watched him from a distance, a mix of appreciation and wariness in her eyes. She was starting to trust him, but she didn't want to. Every time her mind began to relax, her memories screamed at her, reminding her of everything she had lost by trusting the wrong people. One night, while she was looking for her sweater in the living room, she found him sitting in the dark, watching old news reports on the television. The glow from the screen reflected on his face, casting a serious, almost pained expression. The screen showed reports about tech startups, innovation conferences, and interviews with young entrepreneurs. Grace stopped behind him, silent. Mason didn't turn, but he sensed her presence. With a swift motion, he turned off the television. "Memory fails," he said in a low voice. "But mistakes don't." Grace didn't respond. She didn't understand, but she didn't want to push him either. That night, she left him alone with his memories, knowing there was a weight in him that he still hadn't dared to reveal. The next morning, just after breakfast, there was a knock at the door. A firm, repeated knock. Grace opened the door just slightly, leaving the chain on. Outside stood a man in his 40s, dressed in a light grey suit that didn't match the weather. He carried a thin briefcase under his arm and wore a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Good morning. Sorry for the trouble," the man said, still smiling. "I'm looking for someone who seems to have gone missing. A man, tall, dark hair, maybe injured. He was seen around here a few days ago." A chill ran down Grace's spine. She didn't respond immediately. "Who's asking?" "I just want to help," the man said, his smile still plastered on his face. "He's very important to a lot of people." Grace closed the door without saying anything more. As she turned around, she saw him. Mason was peeking out from the kitchen, but as soon as he heard the stranger's voice, he bolted into the bathroom and locked the door behind him. Grace walked over to the door, knocking with her knuckles. "Who is that guy?" she whispered. From inside, Mason's voice, hoarse and tense, replied, "Tell him I'm not here. Tell him you've never seen me." She hesitated. It was clear that there was something serious behind this, something dangerous. But for some reason she couldn't explain. She did as he asked. She walked back to the door, cracked it open just enough to speak to the man. "No one like that lives here. I haven't seen him." The man didn't seem convinced, but he didn't press further. He simply nodded and walked away slowly, glancing back once more. That afternoon, Grace waited until Henry was busy and her mother was asleep before confronting him. Mason was sitting on the rooftop, his back against the water tank. "You have to tell me the truth," she said, her voice sharp. "Who was that man?" Mason took a moment before answering. Then, without moving, he said, "I'm being hunted by people who shouldn't have any power, and the worst part is that I was once one of them." The confession hit Grace like a punch. It wasn't paranoia, it wasn't madness, it sounded like a confession. She went back to her room, her mind a whirl of confusion. For the first time since meeting him, she felt real fear. But she also felt something else, a strange sense of responsibility, like she couldn't back out now. That night, as she was tidying the table, she found Mason's old notebook, the same one where she had seen him writing formulas. She flipped through it absent-mindedly, among papers filled with equations and diagrams, until a folded page fell to the floor. It was an old, yellowed newspaper clipping. The headline read, "Mason Montenegro, CEO of Montenegro Tech, missing." Grace stood frozen in front of the open notebook, a strange warmth creeping up the back of her neck. The words echoed in her mind like an alarm. She looked at it again, trying to convince herself that it was just a coincidence. But it wasn't. It was him. The same man who had been sleeping on her couch, who had fixed her radio, who spoke of mistakes as if they were visible scars. She walked to the bathroom where Mason was washing a few cups. She didn't wait for him to speak. "Is this you?" she asked, showing him the page. "Mason Montenegro." Mason stood still, his hand frozen with a cup still half washed. He carefully placed it in the sink, dried his hands in silence, and then looked straight into her eyes. "Close the door, please." Grace did as he asked. The silence between them thickened. "I'm not going to shout," she said, her voice steady. "But you're going to tell me the truth." Mason nodded, offering no defense. His voice came out low and broken, without the assured tone he'd been carrying these past days. "My brother betrayed me. They tried to kill me. I survived by chance." There was no drama in his voice. He said it while staring at the floor, his shoulders sagging as though he still couldn't quite grasp how he was alive. Grace sat down in front of him, saying nothing. Mason took a deep breath and continued. "Andrew, my older brother, always wanted to control the company. Ever since my father died, we started to notice strange movements in the accounts. When I began to investigate, I discovered that Andrew had been diverting millions to offshore accounts. I didn't confront him directly. I made the mistake of waiting, thinking I could fix it from the inside." He closed his eyes for a moment, as though the memory caused him pain. "He organized an attack. They disguised it as an accident, a fire at the testing lab. They left me inside. They thought I was dead. But someone, an employee, I suppose, pulled me out before the ceiling collapsed. I woke up several days later in an abandoned house near the Chalco Canal. No papers, my head open, and everything blurry." Grace listened without blinking. "They didn't know I had survived. I crawled for days, not understanding anything. Every time I tried to ask for help, something stopped me. I was afraid someone would recognize me, someone sent by Andrew. I became what you saw, a ghost." A long silence followed. Grace broke it without raising her voice. "That's an absurd story." Mason looked at her, unoffended. "Yes, I know. I'd repeat it to myself 1,000 times without believing it. But every word is true. The fear is real. The emptiness, too." She lowered her gaze. Then she asked, "Why me?" Mason smiled for the first time in hours. Not a smile of relief, but of something deeper, more human. "Because you looked at me when no one else did." And then they spoke. The night passed without either of them noticing. Grace asked him to tell her more about the company, about what he did, about his ideas. Mason spoke to her about software for public hospitals, about medicine distribution systems, about decentralized networks for communities without access to the internet. He spoke passionately, as if he hadn't just built a company, but a vision of the world. Grace, sitting cross-legged on the carpet, listened to him as though someone had lit a light in the middle of the dark alley of her routine. "I never thought life had another path for me besides survival," she said, almost without thinking. "Taking care of my mom, protecting Henry, stretching the days out with the money. That's also a form of resistance," Mason replied. "But you can do more. Much more." He said it without judgment, as though he truly believed in her. That night, for the first time, Grace felt like she could aspire to something beyond just surviving until the next month. "I want to go back," Mason said, now more firmly. Take back what was taken from me. But I can't do it alone. I need allies, people I can trust. Grace looked at him intently. She didn't hesitate. Can I trust you? He asked. Yes, she answered. The next morning, Mason had a plan. He woke up before dawn, his face more determined than it had been since he arrived at the apartment. Grace found him at the kitchen table, surrounded by folded papers, the old notebook, and a handwritten route sheet. I need to regain access to my contacts, my networks, he said bluntly, but I can't do it alone. Grace poured herself a cup of coffee and watched him silently. Her instinct still screamed that she was getting involved in something much bigger than she could handle, but there was no turning back now. I have an old laptop, she said after a bitter sip. I don't know if it'll hold up, but we can try. They set up the machine in the living room. It was slow but functional. Grace moved with efficiency, her fingers flying across the keys. Mason dictated usernames, forgotten emails, probable passwords. Together, they created a fake profile that pretended to be an external auditor. With that access, they managed to break into the internal files of Montenegro Tech. Grace, with quick fingers and a focused gaze, navigated as if she had done it her entire life. Were you always good at this? Mason asked, admiring her. I taught myself. Internet forums, videos, surviving teaches you more than any university. Hours later, they had made their way into restricted areas of the system. What they found left them stunned. There were altered documents, contracts digitally signed in Mason's name with dates after his death, manipulated accounting data, and suspicious financial transactions. This is worse than I thought, Mason murmured, reading through the records. Grace found a video file in the internal cloud. When they played it, both of them fell silent. It was a recording of a corporate meeting. The main hall of Montenegro Tech was filled with employees, black banners displaying an image of Mason in black and white. Andrew, standing on a podium with a black ribbon on his lapel, spoke with a broken voice. Today, we say goodbye to a visionary, to a brother, to a business hero. Mason froze. The screen displayed his frozen face, accompanied by melancholic music and a montage of manipulated images. He used my death as a symbol, he said, his throat tightening. He made me a martyr while signing contracts in my name. Grace clenched her fists. It's not enough to expose him. We need solid proof. Someone from the inside who has more than just files. Someone who dares to speak. Mason thought for a moment. Then he spoke. I know someone, Daniel Moran. He was my head of security and confidant. If he's still in the city, he can help us. 2 days later, they managed to contact him. Using a disposable number, they spoke in code. They agreed to meet in a discreet cafe in the historic center near the old telegraph building. At 7 p.m., they sat at a table by the window. Daniel arrived 10 minutes later, wearing a cap and dark glasses. You, he said, staring at Mason with controlled astonishment. I thought you were dead. Mason nodded. Grace noticed that Daniel was slightly trembling. Andrew has eyes everywhere, he warned. This is crazy. That's why we need your help, Mason said. I don't want you to speak. Just give us something they can't deny. Daniel hesitated. Then he took a flash drive from his coat pocket, wrapped in tape. Here are the illegal contracts, transfers, names, signatures, all with your digital seal. I backed them up myself before I quit, but after what I saw, I hid. Don't look for me again. He stood up, looked at both of them, and disappeared into the crowd. Grace and Mason left the cafe, walking quickly, not looking back. But just a few blocks later, she noticed something. They're following us, she whispered. Mason discreetly turned around and saw him, a man, a few meters away, pretending to window shop but following every one of their steps. Without hesitation, he said, "This way," grabbing her arm. They ducked into a narrow alley between two closed stores. They walked through damp, dark passages and descended rusty stairs that led to a forgotten pedestrian tunnel. They came out on the other side of the block, panting. The man was no longer there. "This is just the beginning," Mason murmured, "and it's going to get worse." Grace looked at him, still shaken by the race through narrow streets and dark passages. The fear was no longer a suspicion. It was real, tangible, and sharp. The pursuit hadn't been a coincidence. That man was following them. Someone had sent him. Andrew knew. Mason was alive, and he was being hunted. "They saw us." "They probably know where I live," Grace said, gritting her teeth. Mason nodded. There was no space for doubt now. "We have to disappear for a few days. Your house is no longer safe. Henry and your mom aren't safe either." Grace swallowed hard. Just the thought that her family could be in danger made her tremble. "Where are we going?" Mason thought for a moment. Then he dialed a number on a phone he had assembled from recycled parts. He spoke briefly, in code. That same night, they took a taxi from a corner far from their apartment. They traveled for over an hour without saying a word. They ended up in a neighborhood in the south of the city, an old area with no security cameras, inhabited by artistic collectives and political refugees. The buildings were covered in murals, with rusty bars on the windows. There, they were greeted by Nicholas, an old acquaintance of Mason, with a white beard, an embroidered shirt, and thick glasses. He lived in a house that seemed to be falling apart, full of books, plants, African drums, and a 3D printer running in the living room. "I won't ask anything," Nicholas said, "but you're safe here for now." For the first few hours, silence hung heavy in the air. Grace couldn't sleep. She felt like every step outside was a threat. Mason, however, seemed more at ease. Maybe because he had been through all of this before. On the third day, while they were having coffee with some old bread, Mason broke the calm. "My dad didn't die of a heart attack like they said. He collapsed one morning in the boardroom. The medical report was manipulated. I found out later, but I couldn't prove anything. It was right before Andrew took control of everything." Grace looked at him without blinking. The pieces were starting to fall into place. If Mason's father had also been eliminated, then the case wasn't just about corporate corruption. There was crime, manipulation, dirty power, long before Mason had realized. "This goes beyond a company," Grace said. "This smells like politics, like large-scale dirty business." "That's why surviving was a mistake," Mason replied. "Because I'm a witness." Through a contact Grace had on Twitter, they managed to get in touch with a journalist from El Universal. The guy, who used a pseudonym, agreed to read whatever they had, but warned, "If there's no proof, there's no story, and if there is, you'll have very powerful enemies." That pushed them back into the game. With the help of Nicholas's old team, Grace hacked Montenegro Tech's servers once more. Mason gave her the access, the old passwords, Andrew's behavioral patterns. What they found was worse than they had imagined. Secretly recorded meetings between Andrew and high-ranking politicians, briefcases being exchanged, modifications to government contracts to benefit ghost subsidiaries. Everything was recorded, classified, and hidden. Grace edited the files, added dates, labels, connections. She created a folder that weighed several gigabytes, neatly organized, as if it were a legal case. "If this leaks, it's over for him," she said, her eyes red from so many hours in front of the screen. But just before sending it to the journalist, Mason stopped her hand. "What if we hurt more innocent people?" he asked, his voice breaking. "There are employees, families. There could be consequences we don't see." Grace looked at him seriously. "They're already hurting us. Us. The ones no one sees, the ones no one believes. They started this." Mason hesitated for a few more seconds. Then, without a word, he placed his finger on the key. Grace joined him. They pressed send. They knew that from that moment on, there would be no turning back. At 6:48 in the morning, El Universal's website published the report. The headline covered the entire top of the page. Montenegro tech scandal exposed, corruption, money laundering, and falsification at the corporate summit. Within minutes, the article was republished by local outlets, then national ones, and by noon, it was already on international news. Twitter, Facebook, Telegram, and even TikTok flooded with screenshots of the report, threads analyzing every point, influencers giving their opinions, and hashtags that turned into global trends. Grace watched all of this with wide eyes, from the safest corner of their hideout. Mason, sitting next to her, barely blinked. "We did it," she said, almost not believing it herself. "Yes," he replied, "but this was only the first bomb." At 3 p.m., Andrew Montenegro appeared on national television. He wore a navy blue suit, a neutral background, and a tight smile that melted away second by second. He denied everything. He claimed these were unfounded attacks, manipulations by anonymous groups with shady interests. He swore the documents were fake, that it was all part of a political conspiracy. But Mason observed him intently from the screen. He knew how to read beyond the words. The slight twitch in his eyebrow, the pause before he responded, the way he clenched his fingers, Andrew was in panic. "He's losing control," Mason murmured, "and that makes him more dangerous." Social media exploded. Former employees of the company started sharing personal stories. A former CFO gave an interview confirming that several of the transfers mentioned in the report were real. Then a technician from the servers department spoke with an independent channel and showed emails that corroborated meetings with public officials. The castle Andrew had built with power, fear, and silence was beginning to crumble, brick by brick. Grace received an anonymous message on her phone. Just 6 words. "We know who you are. Stop now." Her pulse quickened. She showed the phone to Mason without saying a word. He read it, stood up calmly, and closed all the curtains. "This is no longer a game," he said, serious. "It's open war." Grace took a deep breath. She was trembling, but she didn't step back. That same night, they began planning the next strike, this time not from a laptop or in the shadows. This time, they were going straight to the core, the headquarters of Montenegro Tech, the building in Santa Fe that Mason knew by heart. There, an old server was kept, one that Andrew had isolated and protected after his death. It stored what couldn't be digitized or erased. To get in, they needed an identity. Mason contacted a trusted hacker, Zico, who still owed him a favor. Zico lived in a rented room behind a barbershop in Iztapalapa. In 24 hours, he managed to simulate a visitor's card in the name of Carolina Solano, a systems consultant. Grace didn't need to look like an expert, just convincing enough. The day came. Grace dressed in borrowed formal clothes, with glasses that had no prescription and a folder full of fake papers. Her hair was pulled back. She was serious, straight, without hesitation. Mason dropped her off 2 blocks from the building, monitoring everything from a stolen van with a jamming drone. They used encrypted channels to communicate. "I'm inside," Grace whispered as she passed through the turnstile with the fake card. "Good. Head straight to the 20th floor. The server should be behind the file room. There's an unmarked door, code 4729. Grace took the elevator without looking at anyone. Her heart was pounding. When she arrived, she walked straight ahead, unwavering. She passed by 3 employees who barely noticed her. The door was where Mason had said. She typed in the code. It opened. Inside, dust covered everything. The server was still connected like a living fossil. She sat down at an old terminal. She inserted an encrypted USB prepared by Zico. She began copying everything: contracts with forged signatures, documents with names of public officials, agreements with shell companies, numbers, dates, movements, all signed with Mason Montenegro's name after they declared him dead. Grace placed the USB in the hidden sleeve of her blazer, closed the system, and made her way to the elevator. She pressed the button. She waited. Nothing happened. She pressed it again. The screen flickered twice before going completely black. A knot formed in her stomach. She tried the stairs, but they were locked with an electronic padlock that hadn't been there before. She returned to the elevator. This time, the button didn't respond at all. The silence in the hallway grew thick. Someone had discovered her. She was trapped. From the van on the street, Mason saw the screen of the drone go fuzzy. He tried contacting Grace over the radio. "Grace, do you copy?" he asked, but only static responded. He checked the connections, the frequencies. Nothing. The channel was dead, as if they had blocked all signals. His heart raced. He shut the laptop, got out of the vehicle, and ran toward the building, hiding his face under a cap. Upstairs, Grace desperately searched for an exit. She heard footsteps, several of them. She hid behind a maintenance door, slid inside, and closed it quietly. It was a small cleaning room, filled with mops, buckets, and industrial cleaners. She couldn't breathe properly. Through a tiny crack in the door, she saw two guards pass by, radios in hand. They checked offices, looked under desks. They were searching for her. Mason, from an external camera connected to the building's surveillance system, saw them too. He had just managed to get into a hidden transmission line. He watched the guards on the 20th floor. He knew Grace was still there. Then a third guard appeared. Grace heard him enter. He opened the maintenance room door. She backed away, ready to defend herself with a bottle of bleach, but stopped when she saw him. "Calm down," the man whispered. "It's me." It was Daniel Moran, the former head of security who had helped them with the USB weeks ago. Now he was wearing a guard's uniform. He looked nervous, but determined. "I don't have much time. Come with me," he told her. Grace hesitated for a second, but followed him. They walked down a hallway that led to a service exit. Daniel used a master key to open the emergency stairs. They ran down 18 floors. When they reached the back alley, Mason was already waiting, his eyes fixed on the door. When he saw her, he ran towards her and embraced her without saying a word. Daniel disappeared between the buildings, not waiting for thanks. Together, Grace and Mason ran to the subway station. They changed lines 3 times before stopping in a park without cameras. Grace handed him the USB, still trembling. "It's all there. Contracts, signatures, government names." Mason held it with both hands, like it was a bomb. He knew what it meant. This USB could prove that his death had been faked, that the contracts signed in his name were illegal. It could clear his identity, but it wasn't enough. "You have to go to the police," Grace said. Mason shook his head. "Andrew bought half of the system. Prosecutors, judges, the press. If I go alone, they'll bury me again. I need something stronger." That night, from a safe location, they contacted Santiago Herrerias, an internationally renowned journalist known for his investigations into corruption in Latin America. Santiago accepted immediately. He said his team would prepare an exclusive report with legal backup, international exposure, and security guarantees. The next day, Mason sat in front of a camera. For the first time in over a year, he showed his face to the world. He spoke firmly. He told his story. He showed documents. He detailed the corruption network. He named his brother, the involved officials, and the complicit businessmen. At the end of the video, he made it clear, "I am alive, and I'm coming back for what's mine, but also for those who never got to fight." In less than 24 hours, the video exploded on the internet. Millions of views. International networks replayed it. Foreign governments asked for explanations, Montenegro Tech's stock prices plummeted. The world now knew that Mason Montenegro was alive and back. The impact was immediate and devastating. Within hours, Andrew Montenegro's public speech was reduced to ashes. He clumsily tried to declare that he had been manipulated, that he had no knowledge of the actions he was being accused of, that it was all part of an internal conspiracy. But the videos contradicted him. The documents signed by him, the recordings of the secret meetings, the leaked emails, all of it pointed directly to his office. The judicial system, pressured by the international scandal and the wave of outrage on social media, had no choice but to act. The Attorney General's office opened an official investigation. Meanwhile, Mason and Grace returned to hiding. The exposure had been necessary, but now it had become a risk. The press was chasing them, trying to capture any image of the two. Mason was the story of the year. Grace, the unexpected figure who helped him rise again. There were cameras outside hospitals, restaurants, even near the old hideout where Nicholas had sheltered them. Some politicians involved started holding press conferences, distancing themselves from Montenegro Tech. Others pretended they had never had any connection with the Montenegro family. Amidst all this chaos, Grace's mother had a relapse. Her breathing became more labored, and a coughing fit forced her to be rushed to the General Hospital in Central. That was the final straw. Mason knew without a doubt that they couldn't continue hiding. 2 days later, he appeared in public accompanied by a federal prosecutor. They were escorted by agents and cameras. Standing at an improvised podium in front of the Attorney General's office, Mason demanded immediate legal protection for himself, Grace, and her family. He formally requested the opening of a criminal case against Andrew Montenegro and all those involved. Public support grew like wildfire. On social media, protests were organized, campaigns launched, and trending topics demanded justice and transparency. Montenegro Tech's stock prices fell to historic lows. Investors demanded urgent meetings. Some withdrew their funds. Others called for a complete restructuring. The pressure was unbearable, and then Andrew disappeared. His house in Lomas was empty. His chauffeur, his secretary, and his wife all claimed to know nothing. In less than 48 hours, Interpol issued an international arrest warrant. His face appeared on all the news channels, labeled with the word fugitive. The news that the board of directors had requested Mason to resume the presidency of Montenegro Tech was leaked by an allied journalist. It wasn't a surprise. For many, he was the only one who could save the company from total collapse. Grace was with him when he received the call. Mason showed no emotion. He simply sighed deeply and accepted with a calm yes. The day he returned to the company, thousands of people were waiting outside. Some cheered, others cried. Inside the building, in front of employees, the media, and cameras, Mason gave a short but powerful speech. I was betrayed by my blood. I was silenced, erased, and declared dead. But I am here, and I am not returning for revenge. I am here to rebuild with ethics, truth, and transparency. This company will once again have a purpose, and this time we won't do it alone. The first decision he made was to remove all board members involved in illegal activities. None were given the opportunity to defend themselves. The second decision was to open the company's accounts to an international public audit without restrictions. He said that trust could only be regained by showing everything, even the uncomfortable parts. Grace watched it all from the corner of the auditorium, not approaching. She had chosen not to be in the spotlight. She didn't want cameras, interviews, or applause. She preferred to remain behind the scenes, where it all began. But she knew, with each word Mason spoke, that her life would never be the same. She had crossed a line. She had become part of something that changed the course of an entire country. And in that moment, for the first time, she didn't feel fear. Weeks after Mason's official return to Montenegro Tech, the hallways of the company no longer smelled of machine coffee or secret documents. There was life. There was movement. But most importantly, there was intention. Mason had come to understand that rebuilding wasn't enough. It had to be reimagined. That's how the idea for a new division within the company was born. One focused less on profit and more on the reality that most high-ranking executives ignored. The marginalized, forgotten communities, young people with no opportunities. He called it the social innovation and justice sector. "I want it to be the heart of everything," he told Grace one afternoon as they reviewed proposals. "It's not enough to make technology for those who can afford it. We have to go beyond that." Grace looked at him, not entirely understanding, until he continued, "I want you to lead it." The news spread like wildfire through the company. A young woman with no formal degree, no corporate background, no political connections, leading a national initiative backed by Montenegro Tech. Grace hesitated. She hesitated a lot. But she accepted. Not for vanity, not for pressure. She did it because she believed. For the first time, she felt that she wasn't just surviving. She was building something bigger than herself. The first direct consequence was personal. Henry, her younger brother, was accepted into one of the best private schools in the city with a full scholarship provided by the New Sectors Foundation. His face when he received the news, his eyes shining with excitement, was one of the moments Grace would never forget. Her mother, on the other hand, was admitted to a specialized clinic where she could finally access advanced treatments. Her coughing decreased. The color returned to her cheeks. Sometimes when Grace returned home after long meetings, she found her mother humming boleros while watering the plants. Mason had insisted on covering all the expenses, without conditions. "It's the least I can do for the woman who raised you," he had said with a firm tone. The media didn't take long to become interested in the story. They wanted interviews, photo sessions, cover stories. Grace turned them all down. When a reporter managed to approach her at a conference, she simply said, "I prefer to make things happen rather than talk about them." And she kept walking. Mason, on the other hand, began to rebuild his team. He contacted one by one the loyal employees who had been fired by Andrew. He not only offered them to return, but he listened to them, asked for their advice, and made room for them. Montenegro Tech began to look more like a community than a corporation. Over the following months, Mason and Grace traveled together to different regions of the country. They visited communities in Oaxaca, Chiapas, Guerrero, and Zacatecas. They listened to stories, proposed projects, connected rural schools to tech centers, distributed solar energy kits and educational devices. In each place, Grace became the bridge. She didn't speak like an executive. She spoke like someone who knew scarcity, frustration, rage, and hope. People trusted her because she was one of them. Mason, standing on the side, watched with respect. He admired her ability to connect effortlessly, to turn each conversation into a possibility. One afternoon, while walking through the historic center of Guadalajara after visiting a small high school that had just received a digital classroom, they walked in silence along the cobbled streets. The sun was falling between the rooftops, and the air was warm, different. Mason, without thinking too much, stretched out his hand and took Grace's. He didn't say anything. There were no dramatic gestures. She looked down, surprised. Then she squeezed his hand in return, and in that simple gesture, without speeches, without promises, something was born that neither of them knew how to explain, but both understood that it was real. A few days later, with the company entering a new stage of stability and the scandals slowly dying down, Mason proposed a break. It wasn't an escape. It was a much-needed breath. He invited Grace to spend a few days in Oaxaca, far from meetings, cameras, and headlines. She hesitated at first, just like she hesitated with everything she had been feeling lately, but she agreed. They both needed it. They arrived in a small town in the Central Valleys, where the streets were still made of stone and the facades kept the muted colors of old adobe. They stayed at a guest house in front of an agave field, where the silence was heavy and time seemed to stretch. During the day, they wandered aimlessly, ate at the markets, sat in the plazas to watch children play among snow cone vendors and women with shawls full of flowers. They visited centuries-old churches, they climbed hills, they laughed with strangers. Neither of them spoke of the company or the past. And for the first time, Mason allowed himself to talk about what was hardest for him, what he felt. "You saved me more than my life," he told her one night as they walked near the Atoyac River. "You saved me from oblivion, from cynicism, from myself." Grace stopped and looked at him. There was something in those words that sent a chill down her spine, not because of the intensity, but because of the truth they carried. But she also felt fear of confusing gratitude with love, fear that what she was feeling wasn't anything more than a mix of misplaced emotions. But when she looked into his eyes, she knew it was real, that it had been real for a long time. They kissed by the riverbank. Under a reddish light, the dying sun cast like a silent promise. There were no words, no promises, no vows, just the kiss, and then the calm. The following days moved with ease. They walked hand in hand through the town's alleys. They drank coffee in clay mugs. They talked about the future, about children, about having a space of their own, about continuing to travel, but also having a home. For the first time, their conversations didn't revolve around what they had lived through, but about what they could still build. During one of their many visits to the artisan market, Mason bought a simple silver ring, unadorned. He chose it for its simplicity. He tucked it into the inner pocket of his jacket without saying anything. He didn't have a clear plan, nor a set date. He just knew he wanted Grace to have it, and when that moment arrived, it would be natural. She didn't suspect anything. She was too busy being happy. When they returned to Mexico City, reality hit like a whirlwind. The news was waiting for them. Grace's face appeared on covers she hadn't authorized. Mason was surrounded by reporters as soon as they got off the plane. But this time, something was different. It no longer weighed on them. They knew who they were. They knew what they had done. That same day, in a meeting with the company's board, one of the attendees read a new intelligence report. Andrew Montenegro was suspected to have been seen in Guatemala, near the border with Mexico. No one confirmed anything, but the rumor was enough to make the atmosphere tense. Mason didn't hesitate. He ordered increased security for all social projects and reinforced the company's digital shield. "Now it's him who's afraid," he said coldly, "not us." Hours later, in front of employees, journalists, and strategic allies, Mason took the microphone during a presentation about the future of the social impact sector. He spoke of results, new projects, transparency. "And to continue with this vision, I want to announce that starting today, Grace Vargas will not only be the coordinator, she will be my partner in this effort." Grace looked at him from her seat. She was speechless. She hadn't expected it, but she understood that this was the path they were building, together. 3 days later, while Mason was reviewing reports in his office at the new Innovation Center, he received an email with no subject. The sender was anonymous. He opened it cautiously. Inside was only an image: Andrew, with a scruffy beard, dark glasses, and a cap, walking along what seemed to be a dock in Panama. Below, a single sentence: "It's not over yet." Mason closed the email, thought for a few seconds, and then showed it to Grace, who had just entered with a folder of community projects. She read it and froze. Fear crept back into her stomach like a slow-turning knife. "What now?" she asked. Mason looked at her, colder, more composed than before. "We go all the way." Internal investigations revealed what they had feared. Andrew had received financial support from corrupt businessmen in Panama. He was in the process of registering a new tech company under a different name, but with the same dirty structure he had tried to hide in Mexico. His goal was clear: to create a rival company that would continue operating in the shadows, far from Mexican law. Mason decided to make the first move. He assembled a private intelligence team with former analysts, ex-agents, and cybersecurity specialists. No uniforms, no badges, just laptops, connections, and experience. Grace, though she had no formal training, was a key part of the team. She used her skills to track emails, intercept encrypted communications, and follow suspicious international transfers. The discoveries were worse than they had expected. Andrew was involved in money laundering, trafficking personal data, and bribing officials in several Central American countries. A well-structured network, with legal and banking tentacles crossing borders. Mason, with the entire dossier in hand, traveled to Geneva and met with international authorities. He presented the evidence, gave names, dates, money trails, and encrypted files. What had started as a Mexican case became a continental one. Days later, Interpol issued an international arrest warrant. Andrew Montenegro was now sought in over 20 countries. That night, back in Mexico, Mason and Grace shared dinner at Nicholas's house. It wasn't a celebration, but it felt like a small victory. "Without you, I wouldn't have gotten this far," Mason said, raising his glass. Grace smiled. "I just gave back what you taught me to believe in, the impossible." A week later, the news exploded. Andrew Montenegro captured at the border with Belize. He had been intercepted while trying to cross with fake documents. He was arrested without resistance. The news outlets repeated it non-stop. The man behind the farce arrested. Mason didn't make a statement. He avoided the cameras. He preferred to keep working, let the facts speak for themselves. Grace, from her office, also didn't speak to the press. But that afternoon, she received a bouquet of white flowers with a card that had no signature. Just one sentence. "Now, you are more than my salvation." Hours later, Mason appeared. He didn't bring bodyguards, just a denim jacket and a small box in his pocket. "Want to go up to the rooftop for a moment?" he asked. Grace followed him. Up there, the sky was clear. The city lights twinkled in the distance. Without saying a word, Mason knelt, took out the little box, and showed her a simple silver ring. "I don't have any more speeches, just this certainty. Will you marry me?" Grace cried, laughed, trembled, and she said yes. They decided to keep it a secret. No media, no famous guests, no covers. They wanted something just for themselves. A month later, they traveled back to Oaxaca. In the same old church where everything seemed to begin, they married in an intimate ceremony. Only they, the priest, a few witnesses, and Grace's family were there. Her mother, visibly better, cried silently. Henry, with his new school uniform, didn't let go of his sister's hand for a moment. At the altar, Mason whispered to her, "Now we are one destiny." And Grace replied, "And one truth." Married, Mason and Grace returned to live in Mexico City, but this time far from the hustle and bustle, from the cameras and the gray buildings of the financial center. They chose a simple house in the southern part of the city near Coyoacán, where the streets still had thick trees. Neighbors greeted each other with a nod, and the noise didn't feel so urgent. They weren't looking for luxury. They wanted privacy, air, and earth beneath their feet. That's where they built their home. Although they were still well-known figures, they avoided anything that might bring superficial attention. They declined interviews, exclusives, and invitations to programs. Their energy was focused on the social project, now transformed into a network that crossed borders. They had taken the model to Guatemala, Colombia, Peru, and El Salvador, focusing on education, access to technology, and community entrepreneurship. Grace led the teams from the field, Mason from the strategy. They complemented each other like pieces of a puzzle that finally fit together. Henry, now 17, left to study abroad. He had won a full scholarship at an engineering university in Canada. Before he left at the bus station, he hugged his sister and told her with shining eyes, "I'm going to change the world just like you changed mine." Grace cried. Mason hugged him tightly. Sometimes the most heroic acts aren't the public ones, but the invisible ones. A year later, the foundation Grace directed won an international award for social innovation, presented by a European organization. The news spread worldwide. Grace, however, kept to her style. She went to receive it in a simple dress, with no makeup, her mother by her side. On stage, when giving her thanks, she simply said, "This is for those who were never seen." Young people from marginalized areas began to see her as a role model. Proof that where you come from doesn't define where you go. Meanwhile, Mason turned down awards, invitations to political candidacies, and tributes. "Power blinds those who forget where they come from," he would say every time someone insisted. He preferred to keep working without the spotlight. One day, during a visit to a shelter in Tijuana, they met Mia, 5 years old, big eyes, silent. She had been abandoned during a migration operation. Grace picked her up without thinking. Mason embraced her the second day. By the third day, they already knew they couldn't leave her behind. They started the adoption process. Months later, the little girl arrived at their home with an old backpack and a ragged doll. When she saw Mason, she whispered, "Dad?" He cried like he hadn't in years. Grace learned to be a mother without manuals, with mistakes, doubts, and patience. Mason found in Mia a new reason, a different way of seeing life. Slowly, the traumas faded away. The future no longer hurt. It began to have color. Sundays became sacred. They cooked together, listened to Mexican music, played cards on the terrace. Sometimes Mia would fall asleep in the middle of the game. Other times, they simply hugged without speaking. In that simplicity, they found a fullness that no luxury could ever give them. Andrew's trial took place with widespread coverage. He was sentenced to over 30 years in prison for fraud, money laundering, international conspiracy, and identity falsification. Others involved also faced harsh sentences. The system responded, albeit late. Montenegro Tech, now under new ethical management, became a model for responsible governance in Latin America. They implemented open policies, constant audits, and social programs funded by a fixed percentage of profits. Mason founded a new project within the company, a rehabilitation program for people recently released from prison. When it launched, he said, "There is no justice without second chances. I had mine. They deserve theirs too." Grace began traveling more, invited to speak at universities, where she told her story without embellishments. Not as a fairy tale, but as proof that it's possible to transform anger into something useful. She became the voice for those who had always been ignored. A documentary about her story was produced by an international platform. It was acclaimed at festivals. Mason and Grace watched it together one night, sitting on the couch. They didn't speak. They simply held hands. They knew that while this was part of them, it was already the past. Mia grew up without knowing all the things behind her new family. She only knew love, security, and tenderness. Henry returned to Mexico with his diploma in hand, more mature, eager to give back. He joined the research department of the company, working alongside Mason as an equal. Over time, their story became a reference in law, business, and social studies universities. But neither books, nor classes, nor films could capture the essence of it all. Because for Mason and Grace, the greatest victory wasn't justice nor fame. It was having survived with dignity and moving forward. Years later, on a cool autumn morning, Grace walked hand in hand with Mia through a crafts fair in Oaxaca. The air smelled of mezcal, sweet bread, and dried flowers. Stalls full of color surrounded the main plaza. Embroidered textiles, black pottery, wooden toys, books by indigenous authors. Grace smiled, not like someone posing for a photo, but like someone who no longer needed to prove anything. She smiled as someone who had beaten the world and learned to live without fear. Mia, now 9 years old, had her long hair tied with a red ribbon. She stopped to look at everything, asked questions, laughed. Grace answered her with the patience she had learned from the daily practice of motherhood. Her gaze was serene, her steps firm, and her presence, even though she didn't want it, still drew attention. A few meters away, Mason watched them, standing beside a stall of alebrijes, his hands in his pockets, with the same expression Grace had first seen on his face that rainy morning at Madison Station. A mixture of wonder, fragility, and something that, over time, she had come to understand as hope. That gaze was still there, unchanged, as though he chose her every day. From an old radio placed in a speaker at the back of the fair, a community program played. The host, with an Oaxacan accent, told a story about how love and kindness could change the course of a nation. There was an odd calm in that voice, a simple truth. Many people stopped to listen without saying anything, as if the message was meant for them. A young man, no older than 20, shyly approached Grace. He held a notebook in his hand, his eyes wide. Are you Grace Vargas?" he asked. She nodded, slightly uncomfortable. "My mom told me your story. You made me believe in the impossible. Could we take a picture?" Grace smiled with that humble gesture that had always accompanied her. She knelt down, posed with him, and let Mia take the picture. "Thank you," the boy said before walking away, still moved. She didn't say anything. She took Mia's hand and kept walking, as though fame had never been a part of her story, as though everything she had lived through had never left such deep marks. But they were there. It was just that now they knew how to settle into silence. That night, back at the house they rented each time they returned to Oaxaca, they sat together on the terrace. The lights of the village twinkled in the distance, faint, like fireflies lost in time. Mason gazed at the starry sky, a cup of tea in his hands. After a while he spoke. "Everything was because of one gesture of yours," he said, without looking at her. "If you hadn't stopped that morning, I wouldn't be here." Grace turned her head toward him. She touched his leg gently. "No, Mason, everything was because of who you decided to be, even after everything." Mia called them from the kitchen. "Mom, Dad, dinner's ready." They both stood up, hand in hand. They walked into the house, laughing and joking with her, like any ordinary family. No poses, no pretensions, just them. If a camera had been filming that scene, it would have slowly pulled away from the house, showing the simple walls, the clothes hanging on the patio, the plants on the terrace railing, a house without luxury, but filled with light, happy voices and history. And so, without fireworks or epic speeches, the story ended as it had begun, with an unlikely encounter that changed everything and two intertwined destinies forever.